Welcome to Nourish MD, Dr. Dietitian Dialogues, where doctors and dietitians empower you about your health and discuss and provide a better path to health and wellness. Proudly presented by Concierge Medical Practice Private Physicians Medical Associates, PPMA, with your hosts, Registered Dietitians and Nutritionists, Papanos and Romana Brennan.
Hello and welcome to the Nourish MD podcast. My name is Romana. I'm one of your registered dietitians and hosts today.
And I'm Lauren. I'm your other registered dietitian and host of Nourish MDs. And we're so excited to talk with you today about anti-inflammatory nutrition strategies. So Romana, why don't you kick things off?
Yeah, so if you were with us last week, be sure if you haven't listened to the episode yet with Dr. Boz, make sure that you do that after this. He's a rheumatologist at UCI. We were super excited to have a great conversation with him. Just as a reminder, coming off of that episode, inflammation is a normal part of the body's tissue healing process and immune function. So inflammation in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's a really important part of our natural body's processes. However, when this inflammation becomes chronic is really when it becomes a problem, and it can open the door to other comorbidities and health challenges. So today we're going to be diving into anti-inflammatory diet strategies in this episode. So Lauren, why don't you start us off by talking us through some of the symptoms or other health issues in which inflammation is often at the core of the issue?
Yeah, I think that it can span so far and wide, and so many of our current health challenges and symptoms have inflammation at the core. And inflammation can mean a lot of different things. And like you mentioned, in acute states, so in the short term, it's not harmful for us. But when this low-grade inflammation becomes chronic, where we're dealing with it on an everyday basis, and our body doesn't have the capacity to essentially fight off that inflammation at a faster rate than that inflammation is building, that's when it really creates havoc in the body. And we can see this show up metabolically, and that can be in situations of, maybe you've noticed weight loss resistance. You're having a lot of difficulties losing weight. You've gained weight and you feel like you haven't changed much within your exercise or your lifestyle habits. This can show up within your blood work, and that could be that your fasting blood glucose or your A1C is creeping up. It's above range. You're having difficulties with getting it under control through some of the maybe baseline strategies you used to do before. This could show up with elevated triglycerides or with issues with your cholesterol levels, with high blood pressure. And so we can see this reflected on a day-to-day basis and maybe how you're feeling, but then also within your blood testing as well. Some of the other common symptoms can include things like joint and muscle pain. And Dr. Boz talked about that quite a bit as a rheumatologist, right? That's something that he deals with every day, is individuals that are having a lot of pain, that are having chronic pain, that are having joint and muscle and discomfort in these areas of the body. There's also digestive issues that can be at play. And this might show up for you as things like indigestion or constipation, loose stools that are often happening. But there might be something deeper rooted that either has been identified through testing or maybe hasn't been, because the digestive system can be so tricky to really identify what is actually causing some of that inflammation. And then I think on a more hormonal scale, we see a lot of things reflected with issues like headaches and mood issues. We know that inflammation is one of the drivers of even depression. And so inflammation can cause things like low mood and more of a depressive state. It can cause cognitive dysfunction, cognitive decline as well. And so really the symptoms for inflammation can span so far and wide, and the ability for what we eat to change how these inflammatory processes in the body are happening is incredibly profound, because if you think about it, food has the power, it has chemicals, natural chemicals in it, right, that have the power to either fight or to fuel the inflammatory processes.
Yeah, I love all of those things that you touched on. I think it helps give really concrete examples of just how many body systems can be involved. Similar to how widespread these inflammatory symptoms can manifest, we can also think about how there are different factors that can influence inflammation. It might not just be that you have a digestive issue, but maybe you're experiencing a wide variety of symptoms, and there are a wide variety of factors that are contributing. So it can be helpful to have this conversation, especially from a nutrition piece, because it might not just be one thing that's fueling your inflammation. And so I hope that we can have some broad takeaways for you all today, and then also following up for those PPMA patients in our group session with you, Lauren, to get some additional really, really tangible takeaways. And just as you had mentioned, this nutritional approach to inflammation, it's more than just adding or subtracting. It's really strategically utilizing these foods that we know have anti-inflammatory properties, but also can contribute to overall a healthier lifestyle. And we're going to talk more today about why is X food good for us? Well, it contributes to the body in this way by this mechanism. So I hope that that's helpful for everyone today.
Yeah. And I think anyone can just go and Google search like anti-inflammatory diet and can probably learn something about the Mediterranean eating pattern, or, turmeric and fish oil and omega-3s and things of that sort, right? And while we are going to cover some of these foods that have really potent anti-inflammatory compounds in them, I think it's so important to note that inflammation can be a very complex process in terms of how it presents in the body. And with complex doesn't mean that we can't use food to be able to support that. It just means that we may need to use different mechanisms of food to be able to help resolve that inflammation. So maybe we can just first start off by talking about the foods that can fuel inflammation. So these are the foods that we see to be problematic for some individuals that are driving an inflammatory response. And then after, we can get into some of these more like medicinal foods that are helping to be able to fight that inflammation and act as anti-inflammatories. So Romana, could you just start off by telling us of some of these common foods that we see that are fueling and driving a lot of inflammatory processes and how they're doing that?
So I want to start off by first talking about this class of added sugars, artificial sugars. And when we're talking about inflammation, one process in the body that we know can be a potential trigger for inflammation that you had mentioned earlier, Lauren, is that blood sugar balance. So if our blood sugar is out of balance, if we're having what we call insulin resistance, so decreased sensitivity to insulin, which is a hormone that helps mobilize glucose in the body, we might be experiencing these hyperglycemic glucose spikes. Maybe that's followed by hypoglycemia, where our blood glucose then falls lower. We know that both of those responses, whether our glucose is high, whether our glucose is low, these can both be seen by the body as an inflammatory type trigger and can fuel that inflammation process. So we want to just be mindful of these added sugars, these artificial sugars that are going to spike our blood sugar, not just eliminating any one of these sources, but kind of doing a dietary audit, if you will, and noticing in my condiments, in my salad dressings, these are all the sneaky little places where these added sugars can crop up. But we're talking about agave nectar, super high in fructose. We know that fructose impacts the liver because that's where it's processed, as opposed to more of like a glucose forward type sugar. So agave nectar, even honey and maple syrup, these are more of our natural sugars, but we want to just be aware of how much of these foods that we're getting in our diet. Sucralose, erythritol, these are more of leaning toward those artificial sugars, erythritol being a sugar alcohol. Any sugar type substitute that ends in OL is sugar alcohol. And then high fructose corn syrup, which we are all very familiar with. Again, high in fructose, processed by the liver. If we're overloaded on this fructose, it can tax our liver, can potentially lead to fatty liver disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So we want to, again, just be mindful of how many different places in the diet are these types of things showing up. If we're having all of these added sugars with our breakfast, how is that spiking our blood sugar and then setting us up for the rest of the day? Are we going to then be on this blood sugar roller coaster for the rest of the day, where we might notice some of those headaches, some of those mood changes, the afternoon energy crash, and the highs and lows that can further contribute to inflammation?
Yeah. And I think sugar is a huge piece that a lot of times can be sneaky for people. And like those products, like you mentioned, you might not be outright adding these to foods, but they are in a lot of foods at restaurants that you might be eating salmon. You're like, oh, I think this salmon's great. Or I'm eating Brussels sprouts, great for me. But the Brussels sprouts of salmon have tons of honey on them for making them taste really good, right? So these are just things we need to draw awareness to. Outside of sugar, I think that The other two that are really big triggers for a lot of people are both gluten and dairy. And gluten in itself is problematic because a lot of people have what's called non-celiac gluten sensitivity, where they don't have an allergy to gluten, but their immune system is still reacting. They're still highly sensitive to the protein that is in wheat, which is gluten. Gluten is found in wheat, barley, and rye, and what is the protein structure. So it's different than like lactose, right? A lot of times people try to think of like gluten versus lactose sensitivity. It's very different because lactose is sugar, which basically means your digestive system doesn't have enough enzymes to break down that lactose. It doesn't have enough lactase to do that. Whereas with gluten, it's totally different. It's not a lack of enzymes. It's an actual immune response that's happening. And that's why even very small amounts of it can create an inflammatory response. And unfortunately, in the US, there's so much modification of this gluten protein that's happened. This is why I believe that so many people have issues with gluten, is because it's just not what our immune system was exposed to as a young kid. It looks so different in our body. Our immune system is like, well, what is this foreign thing that I never knew how to build an immunity to, because it has been modified and it's changed so much. And gluten can be found, like I said, in wheat, barley, and rye, but it can also be more sneakily in things like soy sauce and teriyaki sauces, meatballs, some of your even protein sources that maybe aren't so obvious. Dairy, on the other hand, there's research that shows about 70% of people have an inflammatory response to dairy. And that's because of the protein structure that's in dairy. Most of the dairy, the cows that are used in the US dairy supply, they contain a high amount of something called beta-casomorphin. And that can be extremely inflammatory. And those symptoms can range far wide for people, but it could be like you're having to clear your throat after you consume it. You notice you get postnasal drip. A lot of these more upper respiratory type symptoms, sometimes skin issues for people as well. And so not everyone has an issue here, but it's something to be mindful of. We find that dairy can be a little bit less inflammatory if it's a different type of protein. So most of this traditional dairy in the US is A1 protein, but there is a different type of dairy. It comes from a different type of cow that is A2 protein. And A2 protein tends to be a little bit less problematic. Still doesn't necessarily mean that it's a safe option for everyone, but it can be a safer option that's a bit easier to digest, a little bit less inflammatory, because there's not as much that beta-casomorphin in there. And that's predominantly what's found in things like sheep's and goat's milk. So if you're getting feta cheese and such, that is mainly A2, but you can also purchase A2 as a milk or as a yogurt source as well, if that is something that you need to do. Now, outside of the gluten and dairies that I really think are probably two of the biggest sources that people are eating the most every day, there's other more sneaky sources that maybe we're not even aware of that are coming into our food supply because we don't see them and we don't really taste them. What are those, Romana, and why are these impactful for us?
Yes, definitely sneaky and found, especially now, in a lot of processed foods, dressings, anything of that sort that might be more on the process end are these hydrogenated vegetable oils. So what that might look like in an ingredient list: high oleic canola oil, safflower oil, sunflower oil. Even things like palm oil tend to be slightly less refined, but still can be what is called hydrogenated. So the hydrogenation process is utilized so that these oils are more stable, so that whatever it's being added to is more shelf stable and lasts a longer time, so that these oils don't become rancid as easily. But this hydrogenation process does involve some pretty intense chemicals, hexane, for example. So we want to try to limit or eliminate that as best as possible. So aside from just how these oils are created, manufactured, processed, these are also sources of omega-6 fatty acids in the diet. So omega-6 fatty acids sound similar to omega-3 fatty acids, but they do differ. So both of these types of fatty acids are polyunsaturated fatty acids. They are essential fatty acids. That means if something is an essential fatty acid, we need to get it through food. Our body cannot make it. So within this category of these polyunsaturated fats, we really want to prioritize more of the omega-3s as opposed to the omega-6s. And we'll talk more about that because they're more on the fighting inflammation side of things. But when it comes to the omega-6s, again, circling back to those hydrogenated vegetable oils, we want to limit these sources of oils as much as possible. These omega-6s, they can be inflammatory. Again, sunflower oils, canola oils, those are going to be the main ones that you see. And oftentimes you'll see canola oil and or sunflower oil and or safflower oil on some of these ingredient lists. So always helpful to take a peek at the back of any kind of packaged foods that we're eating to make sure that we are being mindful of that. Even soybean oil, things like that as well.
Enjoy high-quality supplements shipped right to your door with full script through Private Physicians Medical Associates, PPMA. Reap the health benefits of pharmaceutical-grade vitamins while saving 5% on all orders. Set up your free PPMA account today. Visit privatemds.com.
But Lauren, let's move on from the hydrogenated vegetable oils. Can you tell us about some other sources of these classes of foods that might be fueling some inflammation in the body?
Yeah, well, you mentioned omega-6s, and like you mentioned, omega-6s are an essential fat. So we do need some omega-6s, but we need them to be in balance with omega-3s. We need a lot more omega-3s than we do need omega-6s to be able to keep us into an anti-inflammatory state. And unfortunately, what we see often is that most people have very low omega-3 indexes, very low omega-3 levels, and they have pretty high omega-6 levels because omega-6s are just a lot more rampant in the diet. Other things outside of these oils that you mentioned are foods that are high in omega-6, which are commonly things like corn or soy. And corn is obviously found in things like corn tortillas and corn chips and such. But soy, it can also be found in things like tempeh and tofu and edamame. And it might be a large protein source for a lot of individuals that are eating a vegan or vegetarian diet. So it's something we want to be mindful of in terms of how we structure your protein sources to make sure that we have an adequate amount of omega-3s and not too much of these omega-6s. I think outside of, though, just the omega-6 conversation, the other piece of this is that corn and soy are also heavily genetically modified crops in the US. They are subsidized just like wheat is to make very large amounts of them that shouldn't normally be grown. And so they are heavily genetically modified. There's also a lot of pesticides, herbicides that are used on these plants, things like glyphosate and different types of herbicides that we know are really impacting the way that our body functions every day. They're impacting enzyme reactions and how our body can convert food into energy, and they can be carcinogens and a lot of other problems. And so corn and soy tend to be two of the more genetically modified and pesticide laden type food sources. So that's just something to think about. Obviously, you can get around that with purchasing glyphosate free, with purchasing organic. That helps with mitigating the genetically modified portion of things. But it doesn't take out the omega-6s from it, right? The omega-6s is part of its actual chemical structure of the food. So it's something you still have to be mindful of, even if you're buying the healthiest version of some of these. Now, with that in mind, I want to also talk about some of these healthier foods that a lot of individuals think that they should just be eating loads and loads of every day that actually could be fueling the inflammatory processes. So can you tell us what a couple of those classes of foods are that we see a lot of people are eating thinking that they're healthy, but that could actually be creating more of an inflammatory response?
Yeah, 100%. So we have this class of foods that we would consider being high in oxalates. Oxalates are by some referred to as anti-nutrients, and that's because they can bind up some other minerals that we're consuming, maybe some minerals that are even in the foods. And then aside from high oxalate foods, we are also considering foods that might be high in heavy metals. So when it comes to high oxalate foods, for example, spinach, which is a go-to leafy green for so many people, as well as almonds, which are a great nut to be including in the diet. It's all about the dose, right? So we want to make sure that when we're tossing leafy green into our smoothie, it's not always spinach. We're not just having spinach salads, but we have some variation there because we don't want to be bogging down our body with all these oxalates, which again can be binding up sulfur, iron, essential minerals such as those. And then when it comes to high heavy metal foods, brown rice, plant-based proteins, primarily because plant-based proteins might have a combination of brown rice, maybe it's pea protein as well. These are concentrated proteins. So whenever we're concentrating something, whatever is on the outside in the growing process, whatever is on the inside, so these heavy metals can be really integrated into the plant food from the soil. And when we are concentrating that down, distilling it down, isolating those protein sources,